Today we'll be solving February-March 2024 paper 22, the 15-mark question. And this is a somewhat difficult question, so we'll be breaking it down step by step. All right, so it says there is a 1D array called student name. So we'll highlight the information as we go along. It contains the names of the students. Then we have a 2D array called screen time that is used to input the number of minutes on each day. So minutes on each day spent in front of the screen. Then the position of each student's data in two arrays is the same. So we'll have the same mapping of the index, and index 10 in student name would mean that the data of that student would be stored in the 10th index in the screen time array. Then we have some variable called class size, and this would contain the number of students in the class. All right, so the question states that allow all the students to enter their daily minutes, calculate the total number of minutes for each student, so the total, then enter, then count for each student the number of days with more than 300 minutes of screen time. Then we need to calculate the average weekly minutes for the whole class. So we'll need to find average of every student, and then we'll need to find an average of averages. Then we need to find out the student with the lowest weekly minutes of screen time. And then for each student, we need to output their name, their total week screen time, and more than 300 minutes, how many days they use more than 300 minutes of screen time, and then the average weekly minutes of the screen for the whole class that will calculate beforehand, and then the student's name which corresponds to the lowest screen time from one of our arrays. Okay, so we need to give suitable messages, we need to add comments. You do not need to declare any arrays. Assume that the array contains the required data. All right, so this is how the problem is like. Okay, so we don't really have any rounding off here to do or any library routines, so we can directly start doing it. So again, the first step would be planning, and the second step would be to visualize, and then the third step would be to code. So I'll go towards the planning and visualization that I've done. So it's pretty straightforward. The 1D array contains names. So this is what I've done. Here we have names of the students that are in front of you, 1 till class size. Why class size? Because the question clearly states that class size contains the number of students. So you can visualize this 1D array horizontally or vertically, it's up to you. Then we have a 2D array called screen time that is used to input the number of students on each day in front of a screen. So we're looking at 7 days in a week. So there would be 7 columns, all right? And then for each student, we will have class size number of rows corresponding. Okay, so if we have gender on index 2 of student name, that means all the screen time for all the days for gender would be on the second row of your screen time array, like this. Similarly, all the screen time information for Monica would be on index 3, and here it'll be in the third row of the screen time. So this is how it's going to look like. This is the most integral and the crucial part of the program, is that you decide how to actually map out the information that has been given to you. So if you end up assigning these columns as rows, so it will kind of, it will mess up your whole program and the whole code. All right, so once we have planned and once we have visualized, now we'll see what to do next. The question states that we need to allow the user to input their daily screen time. So all of these values need to be inputted by the user, and we'll have 7 days, and we have n number of rows, class size number of rows. So we need to go through each row one by one and input values. Then we also need to store the values into the array called screen time, and we also need to keep track of the minutes that are more than 300 for each student, and we also need to find the total of screen time for each student. Let's jump into the code for this. Okay, so in order to iterate through this 2D array, we need to first select the row like this, and then we need to go through each column, and for this purpose we need to use a nested loop, because this cannot be done using a single loop. So we'll be using a nested loop here, and in order to find totals for all the students, we should be using an array. We'll create a new array, and corresponding to each row we'll save the totals. So the total of rows in row 1, all the screen times will be totaled and saved into total SAT. This is just a random array that we created. Same for Monica, Chandra, and all the way till the last student in the classroom. And we'll keep on adding all their screen times, and we'll keep on saving them in the relevant index of total array one by one. So by the end of the loop, we'll have whole array where we'll have all the sums for the screen times, and then we can find the averages using these. Okay, so let's start writing the program. We'll have the nested loop first of all. So the nested loop should run for row number of times and for column number of times. So rows should be the outer loop. So here we'll say iterating through, we have the screen time array. So we'll have for row 1 to class size, this is the variable that is given to us, and then we'll have for column 1 to 7, because this is the number of columns that we have, which are equal to number of days. All right, now the question says that we need the user to input the daily minutes of screen times for the past week. So how do we do this? We simply ask them to input the minutes, and it would be a very nice idea if we can use some sort of validation here. By validation, I always refer to some use of a conditional loop like while loop or repeat until. You cannot assume that the user will always input the right value. What if somebody ends up inputting -30 or -50 minutes, which is clearly wrong? So here we should use a repeat until minutes are greater than or equal to 0, or in fact they should be greater than 0, not equal to, and then you'll ask output enter daily screen time, and then user will input some minutes in a variable called min. Okay, and we'll declare them all at the end. So this is the first part, validating screen time. All right, once we're done with this, now in the next part we also need to save this in our screen time array. So I'll take these values away for now. Initially the array would be empty, so we end up inputting some value, let's say 30. So 30 needs to be saved here, then maybe 50, then 11, then 9. So for each row we are going towards every different column one by one, right? So we are essentially using the nested loop. So that is what I'll be doing. I'll use screen time row comma column, that will save minutes. So saving minutes, saving screen time in array. All right, so what am I doing? Row would initially be 1 and column would also initially be 1. So the first value that you input would go into this first row, first column. Then let's say we have the next call here. So if there is a next call here, so now column would become 2 here, column becomes 2 here, and so it changes here as well. Then next column becomes 3, and then this column also becomes 3. So for each row, for each student, we are going through all the different days and their screen times are being saved into the array accurately. This is how we iterate through a 2D array. All right, so this is done. Now, in the third part, the question says count for each student the number of days with more than 300 minutes of screen time. And then we also need to calculate the average weekly minutes for the whole class. That means we need to save the totals for all the students as I've done. So I'll bring back the values. So I need to save all of these totals as well. And then at the end, we'll be needing these totals to find the overall average. And then it also says that we need to find the lowest weekly minutes of screen time. So all of that will be done by using this total array that we have made. So right now we're not saving anything, so let's do that. All right, so there is one more thing here. We missed this one part of information that says total screen time in hours and minutes. Okay, so that means if somebody is using, let's say they're using 90 minutes of screen time, that would translate to 1 hour and 30 minutes. Yes, so we need to do some basic math as well, and we'll jump to that in a bit. For this, we simply use div and mod, and I'll show you that in a moment. All right, so once we have saved the values, now we also need to add them in the totals array. So I need to add these values one by one into the totals array. This one, total SCT. Again, you can name it anything you want. Total screen time index row is equal to total screen time index row plus minutes. So what am I referring to? Again, because we are moving row number of times for the outer loop, this will go from 1 to class size, and because my array is 1D, so this will also go from 1 in index 1 till class size like this. So whatever the current row of the student name is, whatever the current screen time row is, so the same row would be applied, or the same index would be applied on the total screen time as well. So that is what I'm doing. That is why I use the row index variable here, loop variable here. All right, so we're done with this. So here I can add a comment adding minutes to total, or you can say calculating total for student. Okay, then at the same time, we're also asked to count the number of days for each student where they use more than 300 minutes of screen time. So how do we do that? Again, we'll simply use an if condition. So counting more than 300 minutes, counting days with more than 300 minutes. So we have the value already with us in minutes. That is the value that the user inputted, 30, 43, 21, etc. So we can just say if any value, the value that the user has inputted is greater than 300, then what do we need to do? We simply need to keep a track of this counter, right? We need to count how many days for each student did they overuse the screen. So we'll have some counter. Let's call it high screen time is equal to high screen time plus 1, and we'll do end if. All right, Okay, so far what we've done is we have just gone through the whole 2D array, one row of the whole 2D array, and we summed up all these screen times. We saved them in the totals array, and at the same time we are also counting how many days for each student did they use more than 300 minutes of screen time, and we need to keep track of that. Okay, so one thing that we missed here is that we did not initialize this high screen time counter. So this must be initialized to 0. This should be set to 0. Okay, now one important thing to notice here is, let's say there are, let me make three different values here. Okay, so let's say there are more than 2 days where the student use more screen time than 300 minutes. So this should mean that your high screen time becomes equal to 2 here. And before you go into the next student's data, this must be reset to 0. And this has to be done between these two loops. Code will run before going into next row. So what happens here? Okay, so let's say the row is set to 1, so the high screen time will be set to 0. So this initially is set to 0, and then every time there is any value more than 300, the counter is incremented, so eventually this will become 2. Okay, and then we do next column, so this has repeated 7 times, and then we'll have next row here. And when we look at next row, we go all the way up, and this row becomes 2, and then the highest counter becomes 0 again. So this high counter becomes equal to 0, and then we redo the process. So we'll again look at all the screen times, we'll ask the user to input them, we'll save them, and then for each value we'll see how many of them are more than 300, and then we'll count them in the high screen count, and then we'll keep on incrementing. And then before we go to the next row, we will again set it to 0. So this is just, one way of doing it. You could have also done it by making another array, but it's not really needed. It's totally up to you. All right, so we're done with this part. Now it says calculate the average weekly minutes of the screen time. Again, this needs to be done separately when we have the data for all the students. For now, we are only looking at the data of one student. Then find the student with the lowest weekly minutes. Again, this will be done with all the data once we have it for totals. And then it says output for each student the name. Okay, fair enough. Total screen time in hours and minutes, and the number of days with more than 300 minutes of screen time. Okay, so once we have looked at the data of all the students, that means we have gone through all the columns, all of the columns for, let's say, Ross. So 7 columns, 7 values, 7 days. Once we have seen it, and before we go on to the next row, we need to output information to the user. So this is the point where we'll be outputting the information. So again, this is before going to next student. Again, because next column here ends the loop here. So this means all the students data from day 1 till day 7. All the minutes we have added, all the array we have iterated till this point. Like this, then row 2, then row 3, so on and so forth. So before we go to the next student, now we need to output some data. So first of all, we need to output the name of the student. That's fairly straightforward. Name of student is, okay, it's saved in which array? It's saved in the student name array. So we remember this from here, right? Student name array. So I'll just write student name index row. Again, why row? Because this is the loop variable that we're using to iterate through each row. You can name it anything you want. Okay, then the question says that the output the number of days, the count of the days where the screen time was more than 300 minutes. So this would be output count of more than 300 minutes, and then this should be high SCT. Again, you can name it anything you want. Okay, straightforward stuff you've done so far. Okay, now we need to do a bit of math here. How do we split the minutes into hours and the leftover minutes? So very easy, simple math. If you, let's say, have 120 minutes, this means 2 hours. How? Because when you divide, when you say div of 120 by 60, this means 2. And div is a function from the syllabus, and this is given in IGCSE syllabus, which means div is used to return the quotient of of well, num1 divided by num2. And then there is another function in the IGCSE syllabus called mod, which returns the remainder of num1 divided by num2. And one more thing to remember here is it returns the quotient without the fractional part. So it simply does whole number division. All right. So let's say we have maybe 70 minutes. So when I say 70 divided by 60, so 60 times 1 is 60. So this will give us 1. And now the remaining number of minutes are left, right? So there would be 10 minutes. And for that, we'll just take its modulus by 60. So 70 divided by 60 and the remainder. So when you divide 70 by 60 and you do not do the decimal division, so 60 times 1 is 70 and the remainder would be 10. So this will give you the number of hours and this will give you the number of minutes. So mod returns you the remainder. Then let's do one more example. So let's say we have 90 minutes. So we'll do div of 90 by 60. So again, this should be 1 hour. 60 times 1 is 60. And then when we take its remainder of 90 by 60, so 90 divided by 60 times 1 is 60, 90 minus 60 would be 30. So this will get you 30 and this would be your number of minutes. So this is how we are supposed to do it. All right, so I'll get rid of it. I'll keep the comments here. So in order to get the hours and the minutes, so hours are equal to, or current hours are equal to taking the diff using minutes by 60, and then current minutes would be by calculating the mod of minutes by 60. So this will get you the number of hours and this will get you the leftover minutes, and then we simply need to output them. So I'll take this above, so we output it all at once here, and then I can simply output screen time in hours, comma current hours, and then output screen time in minutes, comma current minute. All right, so that's all we had to output for each student. So we have the name and we have the count and we have the screen time split into minutes and hours. Okay, now one more thing is left, that is that we need to find the average of all of this time that the class has spent on the screen. Okay, so for that we have this whole array here. So by the time we exit this whole loop, from line 3 till line 40. Once we exit this, so at this point we would have had this populated array for total screen time for each student, again corresponding to each student. So we'll have Monica, row number 3, total screen time would be 364. We'll have some random student here. In the last index they'll have their own total screen time. We'll have Ross here, and then his screen time would be here. Okay, so now we only need to look at this array of total screen time. So now we need to find the total of all these totals to get the average weekly minutes, and we also need to output the student with the lowest weekly screen time. So we need to find the minimum value, and we also need to output the average, which means we also need to find the total. So at this point we'll be calculating average and minimum screen time. So calculating total, average, and minimum screen time. Okay, in order to calculate the total of all these totals, we simply add them as we've done before. And to find their average, we'll divide all the totals by class size, because this is the total number of students in the class. And for the minimum, we use the same methodology as we always do. Initially, we'll assume this is the minimum value, the first index. And then if we look at any value that is less than the current minimum, we make it the new minimum. So 344 is less than 765, so it becomes the new minimum. So 430 is the new minimum. Then we have 487. It's not smaller than the minimum. 368, it's lesser than the minimum, right? So the new minimum becomes 368, and we can ignore that. Then 483, no. 376, no. 406, no. 403, no. 488, no. So the minimum value would be 368, and we just need to write the pseudocode for that. So initially we'll set the sum to 0. So maybe let's call it overall sum, maybe. You can name it whatever you want, and then we have the minimum screen time. We are setting it to the first value in our total screen time array. Again, this is a safe assumption because we don't want to guess the values. They could be, obviously they could be as low as 1, and they could be as high as, some arbitrary number. But in this case, you could have assumed that the value could be set to 0. But the universal assumption is that we can always assume the first value to be the minimum or the largest. You can even use any other index, second, third, fourth, fifth. Okay, then we run a loop. The array size is 7 because there are 7 values in here, like this. Then we get the current value like this. Again, this is just an additional step. You don't need to do this. It just helps to avoid writing total SCT over and over again. You could have done it the same way here as well, but there was only one mention of it, so I didn't do. Okay, then we need to add this into the overall sum plus current. All right, so at this point we are totaling all screen times. So with every iteration of the loop, we are adding these values. So 765 plus 430 plus 487, so on and so forth. So we calculate the sum, and at this point we can choose to end the loop, and then we can create another loop to find the minimum value. It's totally up to you, but I'll do that in the same loop because it's just more efficient that way and saves time. Okay, so we have the current value here. We are currently starting from 765, and I will just check. So if the current is less than minimum screen time, okay, the minimum screen time was initially set to the first value. So we are essentially comparing 765. Is it less than 765? The answer is no. So we'll ignore this, and then we go to the next value, 430. It's less than 765. So this should become the new minimum, right? So we are checking if any value is less than the minimum, then the new minimum should become equal to the current value, and then we end it. Okay, this is not enough. The question clearly states that we need to output the name of the student with the lowest weekly screen time. We do not need to output the number of minutes. So we also need to save the index. Like in this case, this is some student here. This one, let's have Joey here. So this is Joey, and he is the one who used the least amount of screen time. So we need to output the name. And the only way to do this is by using the same index that we come across. So this is at index 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we will output the name at index 4 from the student name. So that means we also need to keep track of the indices here. So whenever you find the minimum value, you need to save the index. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then every time you update the value of the minimum, you save the index. So again, we save the index here. All right. And in order to save the index, we just need to save it in a variable. So the loop variable is I. So we can just create a new variable called idx, and we save the value of I in it. So initially I would be 2 at this point because this is the first minimum that we make, and then the second minimum is 368. So the value of idx, or the value of I, was 4 here, so we save that in idx, and that's it. So with this loop having ended, we would have found our minimum value, and we would have calculated sum of all of these values, which in our case would be, let's say, 4206, and we just need to find the average now, the overall average. So outputting class stats, this is the very last part of the question. Output the weekly minutes and the name of the student with the lowest weekly screen time. So output average screen time for class would be some average, call it class average. I didn't calculate it, so class average is equal to overall sum divided by class size. So let's say if the class size was 20, so this will divide the overall sum by 20, and then we'll also output the student with lowest screen time, comma, student name, index idx. Now why idx? Because this index was to get the student name, and we know the minimum value was on index 4, that was saved in idx because we are updating it every time we see a smaller value than the current minimum, and we know it's index 4, so we go to index 4 of the student name array, and that would be Joey, and this will help us calculate the all of these requirements from the question. So we inputted all the minutes, we totaled them, we found all the number of days more than 300, we found the number of hours, and in minutes the screen time of each student. Then we calculated sum of all the screen times, we calculated the overall average, and then finally we calculated the student with the lowest screen time. And this is the whole question.